She arrived with one suitcase, a broken promise, and the stares of an entire town burning into her back. The man who was supposed to marry her had already moved on, laughing, probably, somewhere she couldn't see. And Evelyn Hart stood in the dirt of Ash Hollow with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. But here's what nobody in that town understood yet. A woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous kind. If you've ever been underestimated, written off, or left behind, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and don't forget to hit that like button before we begin. The stagecoach dropped her off without ceremony. There was no tender farewell, no driver who bothered to climb down and offer a hand. The man simply threw open the side door, jerked his chin toward the muddy road, and said, "End of the line, miss," in the same tone he might have used to announce a change in weather. Evelyn Hart stepped out onto the main street of Ash Hollow, Nebraska, in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in October, and the town received her the way hard land receives a stranger, without warmth, without welcome, without even the basic courtesy of pretending not to stare. She was 24 years old. She had 72 cents in her coat pocket, a worn leather suitcase that had belonged to her mother, and a letter in her handbag that had, until 4 days ago, been the most important document in her life. An engagement letter. The kind a woman kept folded in thirds, tucked close, read again whenever the future felt uncertain. She didn't take it out now. She already knew what it said. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Ash Hollow was smaller than she'd expected. She'd studied the territory maps in the reading room back in Philadelphia, had traced the line of the railroad with her finger, and found the name printed in letters so small she'd needed a magnifying glass. She had imagined something with a little more substance. A bank, perhaps. A hotel with a proper sign. Flower boxes on the windows of the dry goods store. The kind of detail that told you a place was trying. There were flower boxes as it happened. They were empty. The town had two parallel streets. A livery stable that smelled strongly enough to announce itself from 20 yards. A church with a patched roof. A saloon with no name above the door. A general store. A post office the size of a closet. And a scattering of frame houses set back from the road like they were embarrassed to be seen. The mud on the main street had been churned by wagon wheels into something close to a topographic map of misfortune. And there, in front of the general store, stood Warren Albright. He was not alone. That was perhaps the cruelest detail. Not that he was there, not that he saw her, but that he was standing beside a woman in a blue dress with her hand resting on his arm, and her face tilted up toward his with the easy confidence of a person who belonged exactly where she stood. Warren Albright, 29 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that photographs well, was laughing at something the woman in the blue dress had said when the stagecoach rolled in. He looked up. His eyes found Evelyn the way a man's eyes find something he'd rather not see. The laughter died. Evelyn stopped walking. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 10, time goes strange in moments like that. Neither of them moved. The woman in the blue dress looked from Warren to Evelyn and back again, calculating something. A small crowd had gathered near the store entrance, the natural gravity of an arrival in a town this size. People were already watching. They watched now with interest that sharpened visibly. "Evelyn," Warren said. He said it the way you say a word you suddenly wish had a different meaning. "Warren." Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. She hadn't eaten since morning. Her feet hurt. She was 3 days from the nearest person who knew her name. He crossed the distance between them with the stride of a man performing something difficult in front of an audience. He stopped 4 feet away. Up close, she could see he was wearing a new vest. He hadn't owned a new vest when she last saw him. The woman in the blue dress had not moved from her spot in front of the store. "You weren't supposed to come," he said, quietly enough that it might have been private if they weren't standing in the middle of a street with 8 people watching. "You wrote that my passage was arranged," Evelyn said. "You wrote that you would be at the station." "I wrote that before things—" He paused, searched for the word. "Before things changed." What things? He didn't answer that. Not directly. Instead, he reached up and pushed his hat back on his head, which she recognized as a gesture he made when he was working up to something he didn't want to say. She had thought once that she knew all of his gestures. She had thought that meant something. "I should have written again," he said. "I know that. That was wrong of me." "You should have written again," she repeated. The flatness in her voice was not performed. She was too tired for performance. Eleanor and I... He glanced back at the woman in the blue dress, who was now watching with her chin lifted slightly, the posture of a woman who had already won and knew it. We were married last month. I know, but I couldn't... The timing... Last month, Evelyn said. Evelyn, last month. She said it again because she needed to hear it twice. And you wrote to me in September. You wrote to me in September and told me the house was nearly ready. He didn't have an answer for that. There isn't a good answer for that. He made a sound, a short exhale, somewhere between apology and frustration, the sound of a man who wants credit for being sorry without having to fully explain what he's sorry for. And then, because the situation apparently required a witness, the woman in the blue dress walked over. Eleanor Whitmore, she said, extending her hand with the brisk confidence of a woman who had grown up being introduced to people. I'm sorry you've traveled so far. This must be very uncomfortable. Evelyn looked at her hand. She looked at Eleanor Whitmore's composed face, her quality wool dress, the small pearl earrings that caught the October light. She thought about taking the offered hand. She thought about what she would say if she did. She picked up her suitcase instead. Where's the nearest boarding house? She asked, directing the question at no one in particular. A silence. Then an older woman near the store entrance, heavy-set, brown coat, the expression of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them, said, Mrs. Pooley's, other end of Maine. Blue door, you'll see it. Thank you, Evelyn said. She walked. She kept her back straight because she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, that how she walked across the street in this moment was something people would remember. Small towns have long memories. She would not give them the image of a woman with her shoulders caved in. She heard Warren say something behind her. She didn't turn around. Mrs. Pooley's boarding house had a blue door as advertised, and a front parlor that smelled of dried lavender and coal smoke. A calico cat slept on the windowsill with the boneless abandon of an animal that had never worried about anything in its life. The woman herself appeared from the back of the house almost immediately. Short, round-faced, hair going silver at the temples, apron permanently spotted with whatever she'd been cooking that afternoon. Need a room? She said, studying Evelyn the way she might study weather coming in from the west. Yes, ma'am. Just for tonight. If just for tonight tells me you're not sure how long you'll be here. Mrs. Pooley leaned against the doorframe with her arms folded. Not unkind, but practical in the way that people in hard places have to be practical. Rooms are 50 cents a night, $1.50 for the week. Meals are extra. Breakfast is included on the weekly rate. Evelyn set her suitcase down and opened her handbag. She counted the coins in her palm. 72 cents. Mrs. Pooley watched without comment. I can pay for tonight, Evelyn said. I'll need to find work tomorrow. What kind of work? Any kind. I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I can cook, keep house, sew, do accounts. I have some schooling. I'm not afraid of hard work. Mrs. Pooley looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the suitcase, which was visibly old, and at Evelyn's coat, which was good quality but had been mended at the cuffs. The older woman had clearly been reading situations like this for a long time. Come in, she said. I'll put the kettle on. You look like you've been traveling. 3 days. 3 days. Mrs. Pooley shook her head and moved toward the back of the house. Then you need tea before you need anything else. The kitchen was warm. A cast-iron stove, a scrubbed wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, a window overlooking a small yard where a vegetable garden had been put to bed for winter. Evelyn sat in one of the chairs and felt, for the first time in days, something close to relief. Not because anything had been solved, but because the room was warm, and she was sitting down and no one was looking at her. She had not cried yet. She thought about that. She had watched the man she had planned a life around stand in the street with his new wife, and she had not cried. She didn't know if that meant she was strong or simply too stunned for tears. She would figure that out later. You were one of Warren Albright's people, Mrs. Pooley said, setting a cup of tea on the table. It was not a question exactly. In a town this size, news traveled at the speed of gossip. His fiancée, Evelyn said. His former fiancée. Mrs. Pooley sat down across from her with her own cup. And you had no idea. He wrote me in September. He said... She didn't finish the sentence. It didn't matter what he said. Eleanor Whitmore's family owns a quarter of the grazing land south of town, Mrs. Pooley said, not cruelly, as information. Her father and the Albright family have been doing business for 10 years. When old Morris Albright died last spring, Warren inherited the land but not the water rights. Eleanor's father held those. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the teacup. I see. I'm not telling you this to make it worse, Mrs. Pooley said. I'm telling you because if you're going to stay in this town, and I suspect you may not have much choice until you get back on your feet, you should understand what you walked into. I appreciate that. You're not the first woman to arrive somewhere she didn't expect. Mrs. Pooley studied her over the rim of her cup. What's your name properly? Evelyn Hart, from Philadelphia. You have family there? A pause. The cat from the parlor appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation, and retreated. A brother, Evelyn said finally. Thomas. But we are not close. Mrs. Pooley nodded once, filing that away. Well, Evelyn Hart from Philadelphia. You can have the back room tonight for 50 cents, and in the morning we'll see about work. I know most people in this town and the ranches nearby. Someone may have need of you. Evelyn looked up at her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Pooley said. I make terrible tea. She did. It was almost comforting. The next morning came in cold and gray. The sky pressed down low over the hills like something thinking about snow. Evelyn was awake before dawn, which she usually was, an old habit from years of managing a household she'd rather not think about. And she was sitting at the small desk in the back room with her pen and a sheet of paper, trying to compose a list of her practical skills in a form that could be handed to someone as evidence of usefulness, when she heard voices downstairs. She put down her pen and listened. 2 voices, Mrs. Pooley's and a man's, low, unhurried, with the particular cadence of a person who doesn't say much and means most of what he does say. She couldn't make out the words. She dressed quickly, smoothed her hair in the mirror above the washstand without looking at herself too hard, and went downstairs. The man was standing just inside the front door, hat in his hand. Not because he'd been asked to remove it. It had the look of an automatic gesture, something his mother had probably taught him young. He was somewhere in his early 30s, maybe 32, 33, the kind of face that would have been handsome if he bothered to think about it, which he clearly didn't. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that had been shaved recently enough that he'd made the effort. Work clothes, worn but clean, with the particular kind of clean that comes from washing them yourself in cold water rather than being waited on. He was lean in the way that working men get lean, not elegant, not fashionable, just built for the kind of life that doesn't have room for extra. He was looking at Mrs. Pooley with an expression of polite skepticism. He glanced at Evelyn when she appeared at the bottom of the stairs, assessed her in about 2 seconds, and returned his attention to Mrs. Pooley with the expression unchanged. Miss Hart, Mrs. Pooley said, with the satisfied air of a woman who'd been waiting for this particular moment. This is Grant Mercer. He has a ranch about 6 miles north on the Hollow Creek Road. Grant, this is Evelyn Hart. She arrived yesterday. I know, Grant Mercer said. He was in front of the general store, Evelyn said, because apparently she was going to say that out loud. Grant Mercer did not look embarrassed by this. I wasn't watching, he said. I heard. Everybody heard, Mrs. Pooley said briskly. Grant, tell her what you told me. He turned his attention back to Evelyn with the directness of a man who had not come here to make small talk and would prefer they both understood that. My ranch is short-handed, has been since spring. I need someone to manage the house, cooking, keeping things in order, looking after my father when I'm out with the cattle. It's not glamorous work. What is it paying? Evelyn asked. He named a figure. It was modest. It was not insulting. Room and board included? There's a room off the kitchen. Small. It's clean. Evelyn looked at him. He met her look without flinching or performing. That was something. She'd met a lot of men in the past few years who flinched from a direct look from a woman, as though it were an accusation. Grant Mercer just looked back at her, a little tired, straightforwardly waiting for her answer. Why me? She said. Because you're here, he said. Because Mrs. Pooley says you're capable. And because I need someone who can start today. That's a practical list of reasons, she said. I'm a practical person. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. I'll need 1 hour to collect my things and settle with Mrs. Pooley. I'll be at the livery, he said. He put his hat back on, nodded to Mrs. Pooley, and went out the door. Mrs. Pooley exhaled through her nose with the air of a woman who had managed something she was quietly proud of. Well, she said, that's Grant Mercer. Is he difficult? He's quiet. There's a difference. Mrs. Pooley began moving toward the kitchen. His mother died when he was about 20. He and his father have been running that ranch since, and it's had hard years. The kind of hard that grinds people down if they let it. She paused at the kitchen door and looked back. He doesn't let it. He just goes quiet. Go get your things, Evelyn, and eat something before you go. You didn't eat enough last night, and I can tell. Evelyn went upstairs. She packed her suitcase in under 10 minutes, which was easy because she'd barely unpacked it. She looked at the room, the narrow bed, the cracked ceiling plaster, the one window looking out over the side of the general store, and felt something she couldn't name exactly. Not sadness, more like the feeling of standing at a door you've just closed, understanding that you won't be opening it again. She went downstairs and ate the bread and jam Mrs. Pooley put in front of her. It was good bread, she said so. I'm a terrible cook, Mrs. Pooley said, pleased, but I make a decent bread. Evelyn laughed. It was a short, slightly surprised laugh, and it felt strange in her mouth, like a word from a language she'd stopped practicing. But it was genuine. That mattered. She picked up her suitcase and went to meet Grant Mercer. The wagon ride to the ranch took 40 minutes on a road that was more suggestion than infrastructure, winding through low hills with the creek appearing and disappearing on their left. The cottonwoods bare now, their pale trunks standing in the gray morning light like something patient. Grant Mercer drove with the ease of someone who had made this trip so many times the horses could probably do it without him. He didn't talk much. He asked her once if she was warm enough, and she said yes. He mentioned, without particular emotion, that the first hard freeze of winter usually came in November, and that the road sometimes became impassable when it rained hard enough to flood the creek crossing. How do you manage supplies? She asked. Stock up before the rains come, he said. There's a root cellar and a full pantry, if you do it right. First winter I was managing on my own. I didn't know that. We ran short of flour by February. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you talk about a mistake you made so long ago it stopped having an edge. Learned from it. How old were you? 22. She thought about being 22 and managing a ranch through a frontier winter with a grieving father and not enough flour. She thought about it against the backdrop of her own 22, which had involved working as a seamstress in her employer's house in Philadelphia, which was difficult but not that kind of difficult. Your father, she said. You mentioned he'd need looking after. What does that mean, specifically? Grant was quiet for a moment. The road curved around a low hill, and the ranch came into view ahead. A main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, all built with the solid, unornamented practicality of someone who cared more about durability than appearance. The fences were in decent repair. The yard was not a mess, but it was not tended. It was the property of a man who was managing his practical responsibilities and had nothing left over. My father is not ill, Grant said. He's not. He functions. He gets up in the mornings. He goes out when the weather's decent. He eats. He paused again. But since my mother died, he's been somewhere else. Like the part of him that gave a damn about things went somewhere he can't reach it. He stopped talking, seemed to reconsider something, then added, He won't be trouble for you. He might not be much company either. Company isn't what I came for, Evelyn said. He glanced at her sideways. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not a smile, but the thing that lives next to one. No, he said. I suppose not. The wagon pulled into the yard and 2 dogs appeared from around the corner of the barn. One large and tawny, one small and black and white, both tails going. The large one came to Grant's side of the wagon immediately. The small one went to Evelyn's side and put its front paws up on the wheel and looked at her with an expression of absolute conviction that she was the most interesting development in its day. That one's Bess, Grant said, nodding at the small one. She does that to everyone. Don't let her make you feel special. Evelyn looked at the dog, who was still staring at her with its whole face. Is she always this sincere about it? Yes. He climbed down from the wagon and tied the horses to the post by the barn door. Come on, I'll show you the house. Bob. The inside of the Mercer Ranch house told you everything you needed to know about what had happened there. If you knew how to read houses, it was clean. That was the first thing. Not filthy, not neglected to the point of collapse, but maintained in the minimal, joyless way of a man who cleaned because things needed to be clean rather than because he took any satisfaction in it. The floors were swept, the windows were cloudy. There were no curtains. The kitchen had a good stove and a long work table and a shelf of mismatched cookware that had clearly been bought piece by piece over years without much thought for how the pieces went together. There were no flowers, no pictures on the walls in the common rooms, no small, comfortable objects, nothing that said someone lives here and is glad of it. And there was the smell. Not bad exactly, but a kind of staleness, the particular quiet that settles into rooms when no one has laughed in them in a long time. "The pantry's there," Grant said, opening a door off the kitchen. "I'll show you what we have. The root cellar's out back, the wells between the house and the barn. The bedroom I mentioned is through here." He opened another door. The room was small, as promised, with a narrow iron bedstead, a hook on the wall for clothes, and a window that looked out over the side yard. It was also significantly cleaner than the rest of the house, which told her he'd made some effort. "It's fine," she said. "My father's room is at the top of the stairs," Grant said. "He usually comes down late morning. Don't worry if he doesn't say much at first." As if on cue, there was a sound from upstairs. Heavy, unhurried footsteps. Then silence. Then the sound of someone sitting down. Grant looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression that she'd already begun to identify as the one he made when he was dealing with something he didn't have words for. He was doing it more than he probably knew. "I'll get your bag from the wagon," he said, and went outside. Evelyn stood in the kitchen alone. She looked at the stove, the shelf of pots, the window with its winter light. She opened the pantry door and examined the contents with the practical attention of a woman calculating what she was working with. There was enough. Not abundant, but enough. Salt pork, dried beans, a sack of cornmeal, some flour that needed checking, onions in a string, a small jar of some kind of preserves that had been there long enough to settle. She could work with this. She had worked with less. She found an apron on a hook near the back door, put it on, and started a fire in the stove. She didn't have a plan beyond the immediate. She was here, she had work to do, and she was going to do it. That was the entirety of what she had. It was not nothing. She was peeling onions when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Silas Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway, the way people appear when they've forgotten someone was coming and then were reminded. He was 60 or so, with Grant's height and a version of Grant's face that had been softened by age and roughed up by weather. His hair was white at the temples and needed combing. He was dressed, shirt, suspenders, work pants, but not with any particular intention, the way you dress when you're going through the motions. He looked at Evelyn with the mild, flat expression of a man who has trained himself not to react to things. "You're the woman from the stage," he said, not unkindly, just stating it. "Evelyn Hart," she said. She wiped her hand on the apron and held it out. He shook it briefly. "Silas Mercer." "I know. Grant told me about you." Silas looked at the stove where the fire was catching, and then at the onions she'd been working on. "What are you making?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm seeing what's here and deciding." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the faint ghost of something that might have been curiosity, "That's how Margaret used to cook. What's here? What can be done with it?" Evelyn looked at him carefully. "Margaret was your wife?" 28 years. He said it the way you state a fact about geography. Matter of fact, but with the particular weight of something that means everything. He moved to the table and sat down, not as if he'd decided to stay, but as if his legs had made the decision independently. "Were you happy?" Evelyn asked. He looked at her. It was the kind of look that meant, "That's a strange question from someone I just met." But he didn't say that. He seemed to think about it with more seriousness than she'd expected. "Most days," he said finally. "Most days, yes." She nodded and went back to her onions. Silas sat at the table. Outside, she could hear Grant moving around in the yard, the horses being unhitched, the creak of the barn door. The stove was warming. The onions smelled like something beginning. The first week was the hardest. Not because anything dramatic happened. The hardness of it was in the ordinary. The learning of rhythms, the understanding of where things were and how the household ran, the navigating of three people who were strangers to each other, each one carrying something they weren't ready to put down. Evelyn woke every morning in the narrow room off the kitchen and lay in the dark for a few minutes, counting the things she had to do as a way of not counting the things she'd lost. It worked, most of the time. Grant Mercer left for the range before sunrise most mornings. He came back in the evenings with the look of a man who had spent a day doing physical work in cold weather, not complaining, not making a show of it, just tired in the particular way that's separate from sadness. He ate what she put in front of him with genuine attention, which she appreciated more than he probably realized. Nothing is more discouraging than cooking carefully for someone who doesn't notice. "This is good," he said the third evening, about a pot of bean soup she'd made with the last of the salt pork and some dried herbs she'd found on a high shelf. "It's basic," she said. "Basic but good," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about that. "Your mother's recipe?" He looked up from his bowl. "I don't know recipes. I just know whether food's good." Silas, across the table, made a sound that might have been agreement. He'd been eating with them. That was something. That was actually something. Because Grant had told her quietly on the second morning that his father often didn't come down for meals, that he'd gotten in the habit of eating alone in his room if he came down at all. For 3 nights in a row now, Silas had been at the table. It was the small domestic things that she was discovering mattered more than she'd known. The table set properly. Food that smelled like it had been thought about. The fire made up before the cold settled in. These things weren't about luxury. They were about the difference between a place you're surviving and a place you're living. On the 4th night, she found a crack in Silas. She had been sorting through a chest in the sitting room looking for extra blankets. Grant had told her they were somewhere in the house. He was vague about exactly where, when she found, underneath some folded linens, a photograph in a simple frame. A woman in a light-colored dress, standing in front of what was recognizably the barn in a different season, in a different year, squinting slightly against the sun. Pretty in an ordinary way. The kind of face that looks like something reliable. She carried the photograph into the kitchen, where Silas was sitting with his evening coffee, and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. His hands, wrapped around his cup, did not move. "I found it in the chest," she said. "I thought you might want it where you could see it." He didn't say anything. Evelyn went back to the stove, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is give someone room to feel something without an audience. She busied herself with washing the dinner dishes, the sound of water and the clink of pottery filling the silence. After a while, Silas said, "She planted a garden out behind the house every spring. Used to have tomatoes and cabbages and the most spectacular mess of herbs you ever saw." "She sounds like she knew what she was doing," Evelyn said, not turning around. "She knew what she was doing at most things." A pause. "Better than me most of the time, though I'd have never told her that." "Did she know?" Something quiet. "Probably." Evelyn finished the dishes and dried her hands. When she turned around, Silas had the photograph propped against the sugar bowl where he could see it while he drank his coffee. He didn't look happy, but he looked present. There was a difference. She learned him in pieces the way you learn a landscape, one feature at a time, and only when the light was right. He was not a cold man. That was the first correction she made to her initial reading of him. He was contained, which was different. There was something in there. She was increasingly sure of that, but he kept it managed with the same quiet discipline he applied to the ranch. No excess, no waste, everything directed toward function. He worked Saturdays the same as any other day. On Sunday mornings, he rode out early and came back by mid-morning, and she'd learned not to ask where he went because he didn't offer it, and the question felt like an intrusion. She assumed it was somewhere his mother was buried, but she didn't ask. What she did learn, he was meticulous about the horses and rough on himself when he made mistakes with them. He kept a notebook in his shirt pocket that he wrote in sometimes, usually in the evenings, and she was too careful of his privacy to try to read it. He drank coffee black and didn't like sweet things except for one particular kind of hard candy that he kept in a tin in the top kitchen cupboard and ate one of, very occasionally, in the evenings, with the gravity of a man who has rationed pleasure into something sustainable. He was good with the dogs, with animals generally. She watched him with a lame horse one afternoon through the kitchen window, crouching in the yard, patient, unhurried, speaking to the animal in a low voice she couldn't hear from inside, and thought, there are people who can only be fully themselves with animals and children because those are the only creatures they trust not to use it against them. On the 9th night, she was washing up after dinner when she broke the blue crock that had been sitting on the shelf above the washstand. It slipped out of her wet hands and hit the edge of the counter and came apart in 2 pieces. She stood looking at the pieces on the floor for a moment. It's just a crock, Grant said from the table, where he was reviewing some papers. I know. She crouched and picked up the pieces. But it was someone's. He looked up from his papers. My mother's, he said. She used it for bread. He was quiet for a moment. It's just a crock, he said again, but softer this time. The way you say something when you mean something different underneath it. She put the pieces on the shelf. I'll see if it can be mended. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She went back to the dishes. I want to. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read yet. She was still learning his face. It was a slow process, and then went back to his papers. But she thought she saw something, just for a second. Something that wasn't quite guarded. The meal that mattered happened on the 14th day. She had found, in the back of the root cellar, a jar of dried apple rings that she was almost certain had been put up by the previous year, and a small wedge of hard cheese from the last trading trip to town. She had potatoes and an onion and some rendered lard in the end of the flour sack. She made a potato cake, cooked until crisp on the bottom, and served it with the apples rehydrated in a little water and the cheese sliced thin on the side. It was not by any standard a fine meal. It was the kind of meal you make when you're working with what you have and you've decided it's going to be good anyway. She set it on the table. Silas came down from his room as he had been doing, took his seat, looked at the food, and then he stopped. He sat very still for a moment. Grant, coming in from outside and washing at the basin, looked over his shoulder at his father. Silas was looking at the apple slices. She used to make that, he said. His voice had changed register. Margaret, last of the autumn, when the fresh apples were gone, she'd dry what was left and put them up, and she'd make them like that. He pointed at the dish. With a little sugar if we had it, without if we didn't. Evelyn sat down across from him. I didn't know. No, you wouldn't. He picked up his fork. He served himself carefully, the way a man handles something that matters. It's the smell of it. You don't know a thing has a smell until you don't smell it for a long time. Grant sat down at the table. He looked at Evelyn once, just once, quickly, and then looked at his father, and his face was doing something complicated, something she thought he probably wouldn't want her to describe. Tell me about her, Evelyn said to Silas, if you want to. He thought about that for a moment, eating slowly. Then he began. He talked for most of the meal. He talked about Margaret Mercer, how she'd come to the territory from Ohio, how she'd thought the prairie was the loneliest thing she'd ever seen until she'd come to find it was the most honest place she'd ever been, how she'd fought with Silas's mother for 3 years before the older woman finally admitted she was good enough for the family, how she'd delivered Grant in the middle of a January blizzard without a doctor, because there was no reaching the doctor, and she'd just dealt with it. How she used to sing while she kneaded bread, always the same 2 songs, and had a terrible singing voice that she was completely unbothered by. Grant listened to all of this without saying much, but there was something loosening in his face as he did. Evelyn ate and listened, and when the meal was done and Silas finally ran out of stories, or maybe just ran out of words for the night, she cleared the plates and washed up. She was scrubbing the pan at the basin when she realized Grant was still sitting at the table. You didn't know any of that? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I knew some of it. He doesn't talk about her. He needed something to break it open, she said. Not a question. Grant looked at the door where his father had gone upstairs. Yeah, he said. I guess he did. She finished the pan. She hung it up. She dried her hands. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning low, and outside the window, the first hard stars were coming out over the ranch. Thank you, Grant said. For the apples? For whatever that was, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, which meant he was being honest. Grant Mercer being honest cost him something, she was realizing, and he paid it anyway. That told her something about who he was. "Good night, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Grant," he said. "It's Grant." And then, after a second, "Good night, Evelyn." She went to the small room off the kitchen. She lay down on the narrow bed in the dark, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch, the horses settling in the barn, the wind across the roof, the far-off sound of coyotes calling to each other across the hills. She had been in Ash Hollow for 2 weeks. She had 72 cents and a broken engagement and a brother who apparently did not consider her life his concern. She was sleeping in a stranger's house on a frontier she hadn't chosen, doing work she hadn't planned for, in a life she hadn't imagined. And for the first time since she'd climbed off that stagecoach in the mud in the October light, something small and quiet was beginning. Not happiness exactly, not yet, not by a long way, but the feeling of ground beneath her feet. That was enough for tonight. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass of the hills, and the stars came fully out, and the ranch on Hollow Creek lay still in the dark, its windows going cold one by one as the lamps were put out. And if the people inside it were not yet healed, they were at least beginning, in their various quiet ways, to be a little less alone. The third week brought snow. Not the kind that announces itself dramatically, not the kind that arrives in a single heavy curtain and leaves the world transformed overnight. This was a Nebraska October snow. Tentative, grudging, a thin white skin over the grass that disappeared by noon and came back the next morning and disappeared again, as if the sky couldn't quite commit. But the cold was real, and it deepened by degrees, and Evelyn felt it most in the mornings when she built up the stove fire before anyone else was awake, crouching in the dark kitchen in her coat and her boots, listening to the house breathe around her. She had stopped counting days. That was progress of a kind. The ranch had its rhythms, and she was learning them the way you learn a song. First you recognize the shape, then the words, then eventually it's just in you and you stop thinking about it. Grant left before first light. The horses needed tending first, then whatever the range work was, mending fence, moving cattle to lower pasture before the hard freeze. 100 small tasks she understood only in outline because he didn't explain them and she didn't ask more than was necessary. He came back at dusk mostly, sometimes later, once close to midnight when a heifer had gone down in the lower field and he'd stayed with her through it. He came in that night without speaking, washed up, ate what she'd left covered on the stove, and went to bed. In the morning, he told her the heifer had made it. She thought he said it the way people say things they'd been carrying, needing to put down somewhere. Silas was becoming a different problem than she'd expected. Not a difficult one. Easier, actually. He was starting to surface. It happened gradually, the way warming happens gradually. You don't notice until you're no longer cold. He started coming down for breakfast instead of just dinner. He started commenting on things. The weather, the state of the fence by the north pasture that he'd noticed from the window. A story from some years back that something in the morning, the light, a sound, a smell, had shaken loose. He started asking her questions. Not prying ones. Practical ones mostly, but still. Questions meant he was paying attention. Silas Mercer had been a man who'd stopped paying attention to the world around him, and something was pulling him back. She didn't push it. She'd learned that much. Some things you make room for and then wait. One morning in the 4th week, she came downstairs to find Silas already in the kitchen. That had not happened before. He was standing at the window with a cup of coffee. He'd started the coffee himself, which also had not happened before, looking out at the yard. He turned when she came in. "Fence on the east side of the barn needs repairing," he said. "Before the ice. Grant's not going to get to it. He's got too much on the range." "Can it wait?" she asked, going to check the fire. "Can't afford to have the fence down when the temperature drops hard. Cattle push on weak fence when they're cold. I know that fence." He paused. "I built it." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was still looking out the window. His face had some color in it that hadn't been there when she arrived. "Do you need help?" she said. "I need someone to hold the post while I drive it," he said, with the careful dignity of a man asking for something he'd rather manage alone but knows better. "If you're not busy." She was busy. She was always busy. "When do you want to start?" "After breakfast," he said. They worked the fence for 2 hours that morning. It was hard work and cold, and Silas was slower than he used to be. She could tell from the way he moved, careful in a way that wasn't carefulness by choice, the particular deliberate caution of a body that had sat still too long and was relearning itself. But he knew what he was doing. His hands remembered, even when the rest of him had been somewhere else. He talked while they worked, not constantly, but steadily. This section had been replaced after a bad storm in some year she didn't catch. The wood on this post was still good. Grant had driven this one and driven it crooked, and Silas had let it go because it was easier than saying anything. Small histories. The archaeology of a working ranch. When they came back inside, he sat at the kitchen table and she made coffee. And he didn't say thank you exactly, but he looked at his hands for a moment and then at her and said, "I used to do all of this myself," which she understood as the closest thing to gratitude he was going to offer, and she accepted it as such. Grant came in at noon that day for a quick meal and stopped in the doorway when he saw the two of them at the table with their coffee. He looked at his father, then at Evelyn, then at his father again. She watched him register whatever he was seeing. She still didn't know his face well enough to read it precisely, but she could tell when something landed. "East fence," Silas said, by way of explanation. "I saw," Grant said. He came in and hung his coat and sat down. "Looked like good work. It was your mother's fence originally," Silas said. "She picked the line for it, said the light was better on that side in the mornings." A silence. Grant wrapped his hands around the coffee cup she set in front of him. Outside, one of the horses moved in the barn. The stove ticked. "I didn't know that," Grant said. "You were 7, Silas said. "You weren't paying attention to fences." He almost smiled. It was crooked and brief, and then it was gone. But it was there. Evelyn saw Grant see it, and saw what happened to his face when he did. He looked down at his coffee quickly, and she looked away from both of them because some moments need privacy even when everyone is in the same room. November came in earnest. The tentative snows gave way to the real thing. The road to town got hard and then got difficult, and Grant made 2 trips before it became genuinely inadvisable, bringing back flour and salt and the medicines Silas used for his joints and the tin of hard candy that he set in the cupboard without ceremony. She noticed it was a different tin this time, a little larger. She didn't comment on it. She was finding her way around the constraints of the pantry with something close to enjoyment, which surprised her. She had cooked before. She had cooked in her brother's house for years after their parents died, keeping things together in the particular thankless way of women who cook because someone has to and there's no one else to do it. That had been a different kind of cooking. This was different. Here, when she made something good, people noticed. Here, the food she made was part of the structure of the day, part of what held the 3 of them in some configuration of togetherness. And she found she cared about that in a way that was hard to explain but real. She made bread twice a week. She made it in the morning before the day's other work, and the house smelled of it for hours afterward. Silas told her once, on a Tuesday morning, that he hadn't smelled bread baking in this house in 6 years. He said it while looking out the window at the snow, not at her. She said, "Well, you'll smell it every Tuesday and Friday from now on." And he didn't say anything, but something in his posture shifted, something settled. She understood that she had made a promise and he had received it as one. But not everything was settling. One afternoon, when the snow was bad enough that Grant had come in early and was working on harness repair at the kitchen table, the kind of indoor work that winter forces on a ranch, and Silas was dozing by the stove with the calico cat from somewhere that had apparently adopted the ranch without anyone's formal permission, Evelyn went to the small room off the kitchen to get her sewing basket and found herself standing in the doorway with no memory of why she'd come. She sat down on the edge of the bed. It happened sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. A moment when the ordinary momentum of the day simply stopped and she was left there in the middle of it, holding the particular silence of everything she wasn't thinking about. Warren Albright and his new wife and the life she had built in her mind. Not grand, nothing grand, just a specific life, a kitchen, a table, a future that had a shape, gone. Her brother Thomas, whom she had not written to because she did not know what she would say. The fact of being here, on a ranch she hadn't heard of 3 months ago, in a room the size of a closet, belonging to nothing and no one. She sat with it. She had learned how to do that. You don't fight the feeling when it comes because fighting it is exhausting and doesn't work. You just sit in it the way you sit in cold water and you wait, and eventually your body adjusts or the water warms slightly or you get out, and either way, you keep moving. After a few minutes, she got the sewing basket and went back to the kitchen. Grant was at the table with the harness spread across it, working through a cracked section of leather with an awl and a heavy needle, his hands steady and unhurried. He glanced at her when she came back, and she must have looked something, some trace of the room still on her face, because he said, without making a production of it, "You all right?" "Fine," she said. She sat down across from him and took out a shirt of Silas's that needed the collar turned. "Just tired." He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he was actually thinking about. "You do a lot," he said. "So do you." "That's different." "How is it different?" He set down the awl. "I've been doing this for 10 years. I know what it costs. You came here cold, with everything else on you, and you've been—" He stopped, which was the most she'd ever heard him stop in the middle of a sentence, as though the sentence had gone somewhere he hadn't planned. He picked up the awl again. "It's a lot. That's all I'm saying." She turned Silas's collar and pinned it. "I appreciate you saying so." "I mean it. I know you do." She looked up at him. "That's why I appreciate it." He went back to the harness. She went back to the collar. Silas made a sound in his sleep that was not quite a snore. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows with a soft, consistent weight, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp threw its yellow light across the table where the two of them sat working in the kind of silence that is not empty. She thought, this is a strange life. She thought, it's mine right now, and I'm going to keep it in one piece. That was the week she found the garden. It had been Margaret's, clearly. It was on the south side of the house where the light was best, fenced against rabbits with wire that was rusting but holding, and it was completely dead now under the snow. Dead and unattended for years, the bed sunken and collapsed, the remains of old stakes leaning at various angles like something that had given up. She found it when she was tracking down a source of a draft she'd noticed in the sitting room and had gone around the outside of the house to check the foundation. She stood at the fence and looked at it for a while. Then she went inside. She didn't say anything about it that night, but she started thinking about it the way you think about a problem when you're not ready to say it out loud yet, turning it over in the back of your mind while you do other things. What was in there? What had been in there? What could be again? In another season? The next Sunday, when Grant went out on his early ride, she asked Silas at breakfast, "Did your wife keep records of what she planted? Seeds, varieties, anything like that?" He looked at her over his coffee. "Why?" "The garden," she said. He was quiet. She wasn't sure if she'd gone somewhere she shouldn't have. Then he stood up slowly, with the effort that cold mornings cost him, and said, "There's a tin box in the parlor, on the top shelf of the bookcase." He went back upstairs. She found the box. It was a small tin, the kind that had once held something else, with a tight lid and her initial scratched into the top. M, in rough letters, probably Silas's work. Inside were seeds in folded paper packets, each one labeled in small, neat handwriting. Scarlet runner beans, early cabbage, thyme, calendula, good for the bees. The tomato seeds we brought from Ohio, do not lose. She sat on the parlor floor with the tin in her lap, reading each packet. The last one at the bottom was labeled simply, "For next year." She held that one for a long time. She was still sitting there when Grant came back from his ride. He found her in the parlor with the tin, the seed packets spread around her on the floor, and he stopped in the doorway in his coat and his cold face and looked at what she was doing. She looked up at him. "I want to put the garden back," she said. "Not now, it's November, but in the spring, if—" She stopped. "If I'm still here." He came in and crouched down to look at one of the packets she was holding, the tomatoes from Ohio, and read the handwriting in his mother's hand. His face did the complicated thing it sometimes did. He set the packet down carefully, stood up, and took off his coat. "You'll still be here," he said. She looked at him. He'd said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, as though it were simply a fact about the situation. But she heard what it meant, and she thought he knew she heard it. "Okay," she said. She put the packets back in the tin, one by one, carefully, and closed the lid and went to start lunch. That afternoon she wrote a letter. She didn't write to Warren Albright. She didn't write to anyone in Philadelphia, to the women she'd known there, to the employer she'd left her position with. She sat at the small desk in her room with the tin box beside her and wrote to no one in particular, or to herself, which is sometimes the same thing. She wrote about the ranch, the three of them at the table, the seed packets, the east fence, the smell of bread in the mornings. She wrote about what it was like to be somewhere you hadn't chosen and find it starting to choose you back. She didn't send it. She folded it and put it in the back of her suitcase where she kept the things she wasn't ready to deal with. Then she went back to the kitchen because dinner wasn't going to make itself. Grant was at the table with his notebook, writing something. He closed it when she came in, not hiding it exactly, just closing it the way a person closes something private. She went to the pantry and assessed what she had. There were eggs. The three hens had not entirely given up. And a small hard squash, and some dried sage, and enough of everything for an omelet of sorts if she was creative about it. She began. "Can I ask you something?" she said, cracking eggs. "You can ask," he said, which was not quite yes, but close enough. "Why isn't there anyone else here? I mean," she reached for the sage. "A ranch this size. Before, it must have had more hands." A pause. "It did. We had 3 men working here year-round when my mother was alive. After she died, my father—" He stopped. Started again. "Things got expensive in ways that were hard to manage. 2 of the hands left when we couldn't pay them what they were owed. Third one left when he got an offer from a bigger outfit to the north." He turned his pen between his fingers, a habit she'd noticed. "I've kept it running. Just, she said. "It's enough," he said, with the precision of a man who'd argued himself into believing something and mostly got there. She folded the omelet and cut it and put half on a plate and set it in front of him. He looked at it. "Evelyn," he said. She went to get Silas, who was upstairs. When she came back down with the old man behind her, Grant was still looking at his plate with an expression she was getting better at reading. This one meant something had moved in him, quietly, without warning, and he didn't know where to put it. The 3 of them ate together in the kitchen with the snow against the windows and the lamp burning, and it was not a fine meal and nobody pretended it was. And the conversation was ordinary. The fence, the cattle, whether the old gray horse was going to make it through another winter. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Some warmth that wasn't only the stove. Silas went up to bed first, as he usually did. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at the kitchen table, at the lamp, at Grant with his coffee, and Evelyn with her mending. "Your mother would have liked you," he said to Evelyn. Just that. Then he went upstairs. Grant looked at the door where his father had been. She looked at her mending. Neither of them said anything, but it was the kind of silence that means both people heard something and are holding it carefully because it's fragile. Later, when the house was quiet, and Grant had gone to bed and she was banking the stove for the night, she thought about what Silas had said. She thought about a woman she'd never met whose handwriting she now knew, whose seeds she'd held in her hands, whose fence she'd helped repair, whose kitchen she was standing in. She thought about the particular strange way the world works sometimes, how you can end up somewhere that seems like the end of things and find it's actually a different beginning. She banked the fire and turned down the lamp and went to her room. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky had cleared cold and sharp, and through her small window she could see the stars, hard and white and enormous out here in a way they never were in Philadelphia, the kind of stars that make you feel small in a way that's almost comforting, because if the world is that large, then no one disaster is the size it seems. She lay in the dark and let herself feel, for just a moment, something close to okay. It wasn't happiness. She wasn't going to pretend it was happiness. But it was real, and it was hers, and tomorrow she would wake up and build the fire and make the bread, and there would be work to do, and people to feed, and a garden to dream about in the winter dark. And that, she decided, was going to have to be enough. For now, it was. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. She almost missed it. Grant had made a supply run to town. The road had hardened enough after 2 weeks without significant snow to make the trip possible. Barely. And he came back in the late afternoon with flour and salt and a small paper parcel of dried apricots that she hadn't asked for, but that he'd apparently decided were a reasonable addition to the pantry. He set everything on the kitchen table and reached into his coat pocket and said, without particular ceremony, "Mail came for you," and handed her an envelope. She looked at it. The handwriting was Thomas's. She knew it immediately. Her brother's handwriting was a specific thing, cramped and forward-leaning, the letters compressed as though he'd always been in a hurry and the habit had calcified. She hadn't seen it in months. She stood at the kitchen table with the envelope in her hand and felt a complicated nothing, which is its own kind of feeling. Grant had already gone back outside to unload the rest of the wagon. Silas was upstairs. She was alone. She set the letter on the table and finished putting away the supplies first. The flour into the bin, the salt into its place, the apricots. She held those for a moment, thinking about what she could do with them, thinking deliberately about that, and not about the letter. Because she had learned that you can manage what you let yourself think about if you're disciplined about the order of things. Then she sat down and picked up the envelope and opened it. Thomas Hart was 31 years old and had been, for most of Evelyn's memory, a man who moved through the world with the comfortable assurance of someone who had never been seriously inconvenienced. He was not cruel. That was the thing she always had to remind herself when she tried to make sense of him. He was not a cruel man. He simply did not extend his imagination far enough to fully register what his decisions cost other people. He wrote to her now in 3 pages of his cramped forward-leaning hand, and he was sorry, he said. He was very sorry. She read the letter twice. Then she set it flat on the table and pressed her palms down on it and looked at the window for a while. The shape of what he was telling her was this. Thomas had known. Not after the fact, not slowly, not pieced together from rumors the way she had been in the process of piecing things together herself. He had known before she'd ever left Philadelphia that Warren Albright was no longer intending to marry her. He had been in correspondence with Albright for months, over a debt that Thomas had accumulated, a debt that had apparently grown large enough that it had become leverage. Albright had offered to absorb the debt in exchange for a number of things, one of which was Thomas quietly facilitating Evelyn's departure from Philadelphia, getting her out of the city, away from the social circles where the broken engagement would be immediately known and talked about, where she might have had recourse to people who knew them both. Thomas framed this in his letter as an impossible situation. He framed it as something he'd had no choice about. He used the word sorry 9 times in 3 pages and the word choice only once, in the sentence "I had no choice," which told her something about where his thinking had settled. What he did not say, what she had to read between the lines to find, was the rest of it. The arranged passage. Her ticket to Ash Hollow had not been Warren Albright's gesture of decency, as she'd believed. It had been paid by Thomas, with Albright's money, as part of the arrangement. She had been, in the most precise and awful sense, exported. She sat with that for a while. The back door opened and Grant came in, stamping cold off his boots, and stopped when he saw her face. "What's happened?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about saying nothing, or something partial, or something that would require less explanation. She was tired of managing what she said to protect other people's comfort. She was very tired of that. "My brother knew Warren Albright was not going to marry me," she said. "Before I left Philadelphia. He knew and he didn't tell me." She paused. "He arranged for my passage here as part of a financial agreement with Warren." Grant was very still. He had the quality, when something serious landed, of becoming more still rather than less. It was a stillness that wasn't emptiness, more like a man gathering himself before he speaks so that what he says will be worth saying. "Your brother sold your passage," he said. "That's one way to say it. Is there another way?" She folded the letter. "He would say he had no choice." "People who have no choices usually have some," Grant said. "They just don't like the ones that cost them something." She looked at him. He wasn't saying it to be sharp. It didn't have that quality, the quality of someone performing insight for effect. He was just saying what he thought was true. She had come to rely on that about him, the directness of him, the way he said things without dressing them in anything. "There's more," she said. She told him the rest of it. She wasn't sure when she started that she intended to tell him all of it, but once she began, it kept coming. Not emotionally, not with tears, just with the flat, precise quality of someone laying out facts that needed to be laid out. The debt, the arrangement, the way she had been moved around like a piece on a board by 2 men who had each decided that their problems were more important than her life. Grant listened. He did not interrupt. He did not make the sounds that people sometimes make when they're performing sympathy rather than actually listening. He just listened, and when she was done, he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Did the letter say anything about documents?" She frowned. "What kind of documents?" "Anything official. Anything with your name on it." "No." She looked at him. "Why?" He set his jaw slightly. A small movement, a tell. Because a man who would make that kind of arrangement doesn't always stop at one. He sat down across from her at the table. When I was in town today, Harlan Briggs stopped me at the post office. Harlan Briggs was the man who ran the post office and, as a secondary occupation, served as a kind of informal clearinghouse for legal and financial information in Ash Hollow. Not a lawyer, but the closest thing the town had to one. She had seen him once, briefly, a thin man with careful eyes. He told me there was a document filed last week at the county seat, Grant said. A debt notice. In your name. The words took a second to reach her. In my name. $40? Claimed as an outstanding loan issued to one Evelyn Hart of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, assigned to a collector named Douglas Crane. He watched her face. Do you know that name? No. Briggs didn't either, but he knew the signature on the filing. It was a man named Aldous Webb. He's an associate of Warren Albright's. He handles Albright's business dealings when Albright doesn't want his name on something. Evelyn put both hands flat on the table. Not angry yet. Something colder than anger, something that required more precision. I have never borrowed $40 from anyone, she said. I know that. The document is forged. Almost certainly, Grant said. He said it without hedging, without the careful qualification of a man who is trying to protect himself from being wrong. The question is what they want from it. She thought about that. It didn't take long. She'd been poor enough, recently enough, to understand exactly what a $40 debt notice meant for a woman alone in a frontier town with 72 cents to her name. It was a lever. It was a way of keeping her manageable, keepable, quiet. A woman with a debt notice on her name couldn't testify to anything that would embarrass the men who'd put it there without finding herself in worse trouble. It was elegant, in the ugly way that traps are elegant. They want me to stay quiet, she said. I think so. About Warren and Thomas and the arrangement. If there's anyone in the territory who would care, yes. She stood up. She needed to move, and the kitchen was small, so she went to the window and stood looking out at the yard where the wagon was still half loaded and one of the dogs was investigating something near the barn with intense concentration. The world outside looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. That was strange. It always seemed strange when the world outside didn't register what had changed indoors. Who would care? She said. The Whitmore family might, Grant said. Eleanor Whitmore's father is a careful man. If he knew that Warren Albright had used his daughter, as part of a scheme to settle debts while simultaneously running another woman out of Philadelphia, he might find that inconvenient. Eleanor isn't part of this, Evelyn said. She said it carefully because it was a careful distinction. She married Warren. That's real. It's real, Grant agreed. It doesn't mean she knew how real her father's money was to Warren's decision-making. She turned back from the window. You think there's a way to use this? The information. I think there might be a way to make it so the debt notice disappears, he said, without you spending $40 you don't have, or compromising what's left of your name in this town. She looked at him. He was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and he looked tired. He always looked tired at this hour. It was the physical day in his face, but his eyes were clear and thinking. Why are you doing this? She said. He blinked. It was apparently a question he hadn't expected, which meant he hadn't been thinking about it as something he was choosing to do. What do you mean? You could stay out of this. This isn't your business. You hired me to cook and keep the house. This, she gestured at the letter. This is mine. You live here, he said. I work here. You live here, he said again, with exactly the same weight as the first time, as if the distinction she was drawing wasn't one he recognized. He looked at the table for a moment. I don't look. My mother came to this territory from Ohio with $30 and a man who wasn't sure he deserved her. My father let her down more than once in those early years. Not like this. But he made choices that cost her things, and she carried them and didn't make him feel the full weight of it because that's what women were supposed to do. He stopped. I'm not saying I know how to fix this. I'm saying I'm not going to sit across the table from you and watch you figure out how to carry it alone if there's something I can do. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. This was, she was realizing, the most he had ever said to her in one stretch. It had cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he looked at the table rather than her, the same way Silas looked away from things when they mattered too much. There was something in the Mercer men about direct emotion, a kind of instinctive defensiveness against it, as though they'd learned early that feeling things fully made you vulnerable to them. She sat back down. What would you need? I need to know who Thomas owed the debt to originally, before Albright took it on. And I need to know if there were any other names involved in the arrangement, anyone besides your brother and Albright. She reached for the letter and read it again, slowly, more carefully this time. He mentions a man called Garrett, she said. He doesn't give a first name. He says Garrett was involved in the original transaction, that Albright brought him in. Garrett, Grant said. He said it as if he was filing it. Briggs might know that name. What are you going to do? Go back to town, he said. Tomorrow, if the road holds. Talk to Briggs. He hesitated. There may be someone else. A woman named Ruth Caswell. She's been in Ash Hollow since the beginning, runs the feed supply on the East End. She knows Warren Albright's business dealings better than anyone because her husband did business with his father for 20 years before he died. If there's something irregular in Albright's history with documents and debt arrangements, Ruth would know. Evelyn had not heard of Ruth Caswell. Why would she help? Grant allowed something small and wry to shift across his expression. Because she has no reason to protect Warren Albright and several reasons not to. He underpaid her husband for a cattle deal 3 years before the man died, and she has not forgotten it. He stood up. She doesn't do things as favors, she does them as accounts. She thought about that. Tell her I'll write to her. Before you go, let me write to her. Tonight? Tonight. He nodded and went to the window and looked out at the yard, and she went to get the paper and pen from the small desk in her room. She walked quickly, with the brisk momentum of someone who has finished being shocked and started being angry, which is always more useful. She found the paper. She found the pen. She sat down on the edge of the bed for exactly 3 seconds, not because she needed to, but because she allowed herself that much. 3 seconds of just feeling how angry she was, feeling it clearly and completely, and then she stood up and went back to the kitchen. She wrote the letter to Ruth Caswell at the kitchen table while Grant finished unloading the wagon by lamplight. She wrote clearly and without apology, laying out what she knew, what she suspected, and what she needed. She wrote like a woman who had stopped asking for things politely and started stating them plainly. When she was done, she read it over once, changed 2 words, and sealed it. Then she wrote a second letter. This one was to Thomas. This one took longer. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew too well and had to choose, from the full weight of what she knew, what was actually worth saying. You can't say everything. There isn't room for everything, and most of it wouldn't land anyway. What she chose, finally, was short and exact. She told him that she knew the full shape of what he'd done, that she was not going to carry the debt notice on her name, that if he had any documents in his possession that related to the arrangement with Albright, any letters, any receipts, any record of what had passed between them, he needed to send them to her, immediately. She told him that this was not a request. She told him one other thing. She told him that if there came a point at which he had a genuine choice between his comfort and her well-being, and he chose himself again, she would have nothing further to say to him. That was all. She didn't threaten. She didn't elaborate. She sealed the letter and put it with Ruth Caswell's and set both of them on the table for Grant to take to the post office in the morning. Silas came downstairs while she was doing this, with the unhurried timing of a man who has learned to read the sounds of the house. He looked at her face, then at the letters, then at Grant coming through the back door. What's happened? He said. Grant looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Silas. She told him. She was direct about it, not sparing the details, not managing it into something softer than it was. She had noticed that Silas Mercer was a man who responded badly to being managed and well to being told the truth. He listened with the particular stillness that he and Grant shared, some inherited composure under pressure, and when she was done, he sat down at the table and looked at the letters. $40, he said. Forged, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I knew a man once who did something similar, out in Missouri, before we came here. Put a debt notice on a widow woman who'd seen too much of his business. He looked up at her. It didn't end well for him. What happened? Evelyn asked. The widow had a good memory and a long patience, Silas said, and she knew people he'd underestimated. He picked up Ruth Caswell's letter, and looked at the name on it without reading the contents. Is this woman trustworthy? Grant thinks so, Evelyn said. Silas looked at his son. Grant gave a small, definitive nod. Silas set the letter down. Then go to town tomorrow, he said to Grant. Early. He pushed back from the table and started to stand, and then stopped and looked at Evelyn with the frank, unornamented gaze of a man who had learned, late in his life, to say things when they needed saying. They picked the wrong woman to try that with, he said. I want you to know I think that. She met his eyes. I know it. He nodded once and went upstairs. She listened to his footsteps overhead, the familiar creak of his room, and then the house was quiet again. Grant was at the stove, banking the fire for the night. He had started doing that, taking over that particular task without announcement about a week ago, and she had let him without comment. He worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times it's become part of his body. She watched him for a moment. Grant, she said. He turned. If this goes wrong, she said, if Ruth Caswell doesn't know anything useful, or if the document is further along than Briggs thinks, I need you to know I won't let it fall on this ranch. Whatever happens with the debt notice, I will handle it myself. I won't let it become your problem. He looked at her with something she had not seen on his face before. Not pity. Something closer to exasperation, but underneath the exasperation was something else. Something warmer and harder to name. I'm aware you can handle things yourself, he said. I've watched you handle things since the day you got here. He turned back to the stove. That's not the point. Then what is the point? He was quiet for a moment, closing the damper on the stove with a small metallic click. The point, he said, is that you don't have to. She didn't have an answer for that. She stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, and then she said goodnight and went to her room. She lay in the dark with the letter from Thomas on the desk beside her, and she let herself feel all of it, properly, without controlling it. The anger at her brother, which was real and specific and not going to go away. The colder anger at Warren Albright, who had managed everything from a comfortable distance and would continue to do so unless something made that impossible. The fear, which she wasn't going to pretend wasn't there. The fear of the debt notice, of what it could do, of how quickly a woman alone could be made to seem like less than she was by a piece of paper with her name on it. And underneath all of that, something else. Something she didn't examine too closely because it was still too new, and she'd already had enough things taken from her that she'd held too soon, just the fact of what Grant had said. You don't have to. Said in that flat, quiet Grant Mercer way of his, as though it were obvious, as though of course she didn't have to. As though the whole point of other people was that you weren't required to carry everything alone. She hadn't heard that in a long time. She might not have ever heard it said quite that way. Outside, the stars were out again. She could see them through the small window, the same enormous frontier stars that had startled her that first night on the ranch, still startling her, possibly always going to startle her. The horse in the barn moved and settled. A coyote called once and went silent. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow was coming, with its particular requirements, and she was going to meet it the way she'd been meeting everything since she stepped off that stagecoach. One foot and then the other. Not because it was easy, but because stopping was the one thing she'd decided she wasn't going to do. The debt notice had a forged signature on it. The men who'd put it there thought she was alone and humiliated and manageable. They had been watching the woman who climbed off a stagecoach in the mud and thought they saw someone they could push around. They had not been watching carefully enough. Grant left for town before the sun was properly up. Evelyn heard him go. The quiet movements in the kitchen, the back door, the horses being brought out of the barn. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of his departure, and then got up and dressed and built the fire, because that was what the morning required regardless of everything else. Silas came down earlier than usual. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window watching the road, which was empty now, the wagon tracks already hardening in the cold. He didn't say anything about Grant or about the letters. He drank his coffee, and after a while he said, "The gray horse is favoring his left front again." "I noticed yesterday," Evelyn said. "I'll look at him this morning." He set his cup down. "Give me something to do." That was all. But she understood what it meant. He was restless in the way that men get restless when something is happening that they can't control, and the only thing available is physical work. She understood the impulse, She'd spent the morning scrubbing the kitchen floor with more force than was strictly necessary. She did not expect things to move quickly. She had prepared herself for waiting, for a week, maybe two, for Grant to come back with whatever Harlan Briggs and Ruth Caswell could offer, and then for more letters, more careful maneuvering, the slow grinding work of proving something that powerful men had arranged carefully to be unprovable. She had built herself into patience for all of that. She was wrong about the timeline. Grant came back the same evening. He came in fast, the wagon moving at more of a clip than the road deserved, and when he came through the kitchen door, his face was different than when he'd left. Not excited. Grant Mercer was constitutionally incapable of excited, but there was something tightly coiled in him, the expression of a man carrying information that has weight. Silas appeared in the doorway from the sitting room before Grant even had his coat off. Ruth Caswell was already expecting you, Grant said, sitting down at the table. He said it to Evelyn. She'd already heard about the debt notice. She has... He stopped, organized something in his thinking. She has records. Evelyn sat down across from him. What kind of records? Correspondence between Albright and a man named Garrett Cole. That's the Garrett from your brother's letter. First name Garrett, Cole is the surname. Cole is a debt broker. He operates out of Dodge City, but he does work in this territory when Albright needs it. Ruth's husband dealt with Cole directly 3 years ago over the underpaid cattle deal. He kept every letter. Grant put his hat on the table. In one of those letters, Cole references a previous arrangement with Albright involving his exact words, Briggs read it to me directly, involving a Philadelphia departure, a woman's name, and a passage fee settled through a third party. He doesn't use your name, but he references the third party as T.H., Thomas Hart. Evelyn put her hands in her lap where no one could see what they were doing. That's enough to connect it, she said. If Briggs will testify to reading it, Briggs will do more than that, Grant said. He filed a response to the debt notice this afternoon on your behalf. A formal contest. He said the county clerk, man named Foster, he's been wanting a reason to look at Albright's filings for 2 years. Apparently Albright cost him something personal back in the day. Foster is willing to open the original documentation for review. Silas made a sound from the doorway. Not a word. Just a sound that meant he was satisfied with the direction of things. When? Evelyn said. Foster wants a meeting in town. Public record, which means it has to be at the courthouse. Such as it is. Ash Hollow's courthouse was a single room attached to the back of the post office with a judge's bench that the circuit judge used 4 times a year. The circuit judge isn't due until spring, but Foster has authority to conduct a preliminary debt hearing. He's scheduled it for 10 days out. 10 days? She had expected months. Albright will know before then, she said. Albright already knows, Grant said. Briggs sent notification to his address at close of business today, required by the process. He met her eyes steadily. He'll have 10 days to respond or to make this go away quietly. He won't make it go away quietly, Evelyn said. That's not who he is. No, Grant agreed. It isn't. She thought about that. About Warren Albright in his new vest with his water rights secured and his father's debt managed and his new wife on his arm. She thought about the way he'd said her name in the street, Evelyn, with that particular mixture of guilt and inconvenience as though her existence were a logistical problem he'd mostly solved. She thought about 10 days and what he would do with them. He'll try to shore up the document, she said. Find someone to testify that the debt is real. Manufacture a witness. Probably, Grant said. Then we need to move faster than he does. She said it without planning to, and then it was out there on the table between them, and she found she meant it. She had spent the entire time since the letter arrived being careful, being measured, letting the process work at its pace. She was done with that. The debt notice was forged. The arrangement that had sent her across the country like a piece of unwanted mail was documented in letters that a dead man's widow had kept out of pure stubborn accounting. The men who had managed her life from a comfortable distance were, for the first time, exposed to something they couldn't fully control. She was not going to let them regain their footing. I want to go to town, she said. Not for the hearing, before it. I want to talk to Ruth Caswell myself. Grant looked at her for a moment. The road's rough. I know the road. It'll be cold. Grant. He stopped. A brief, almost imperceptible thing happened around his mouth. Day after tomorrow, he said. The ground needs 1 more day to firm up. Ruth Caswell was not what Evelyn had imagined. She had built a picture from Grant's description, a woman who kept accounts, who did not do things as favors. And she had filled in the rest with something formidable and probably severe. What she found, when Grant brought her through the door of the feed supply on the east end of Ash Hollow's main street, was a small woman of about 60 in a practical brown dress, with her gray hair pinned back and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the particular unimpressed expression of someone who has seen most categories of human behavior and filed them accordingly. Ruth Caswell looked at Evelyn the way she might look at a new piece of equipment she was considering purchasing, with genuine assessment and no performance of warmth. "You're smaller than I expected," Ruth said. "People say that," Evelyn said. "I don't mean it as a compliment or an insult, just an observation." Ruth moved behind the wide counter of the feed supply and opened a drawer and took out a flat wooden box. "Sit down, both of you. Grant, there's coffee on the stove if you want it." She said this in the tone of someone who doesn't actually care whether he wants it, but has covered the social obligation. Grant got coffee. Evelyn sat in the straight-back chair on the customer side of the counter. Ruth set the box in front of her and opened it. The letters were organized, tied in 3 separate bundles with different colored string, labeled in Ruth's small handwriting on slips tucked under each tie. Evelyn could see dates, names, amounts, the kind of organization that was either very natural to a person or the result of having been wronged in a way that made you want the evidence to be unimpeachable. "My husband kept everything," Ruth said. "He was not, in most respects, a careful man, but he had been in business long enough to know that paper is the only thing that survives when a man's word turns out to be worth less than he claimed." She tapped the first bundle. "This is the correspondence between my husband and Garrett Cole. 18 months of it. Cole was Albright's instrument for most of his less formal financial arrangements. The man has the ethics of a fence post and less personality." She tapped the second bundle. "This is what Cole sent to my husband after the deal went wrong, including, in the third letter from the right, a reference to another arrangement he was managing for Albright in the same period. He doesn't name your brother. He references the amount and a description that, well," she looked at Evelyn over her glasses, "it fits." Evelyn reached for the bundle. Ruth didn't stop her. The letter was dated 18 months ago. Cole's handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a man who had learned that vague language was dangerous. He wrote to Ruth's husband about the cattle settlement, and then, in the third paragraph, in a tone so businesslike it was almost surreal, he noted that another Philadelphia matter had been resolved satisfactorily, that the departure had been arranged, and that TH had fulfilled his end at some personal cost, but that this was not Cole's concern. "Albright is pleased," Cole had written. "The situation is tidied. The situation is tidied." Evelyn set the letter down very carefully on the counter. She looked at the surface of the wood for a moment. "Miss Hart," Ruth said. She looked up. "I'm going to testify at the preliminary hearing," Ruth said. It was not an offer. It was a statement of intent, the way a woman speaks when she's already decided. "I will bring these letters, and I will read from them if Foster requires it, and I will tell the hearing exactly what my husband understood the arrangement to be." She paused. "I want something in return." "What?" "I want it known, publicly, in the record of the hearing, that my husband's estate was owed $140 by Warren Albright for the underpaid cattle transaction, that Albright refused the debt, and that the documentation exists." Her eyes were very steady. "I am not asking for the money. Albright doesn't have the kind of money that would matter to me at this point. I want the record." "You want his credibility," Evelyn said. "I want the truth documented where people can find it," Ruth said. "Same thing you want." Evelyn looked at her. Ruth Caswell had the face of a woman who had been angry for 3 years and kept it so controlled and so purposeful that it had become a kind of fuel. Evelyn recognized that. It was not so different from what she was running on herself. "Done," Evelyn said. Ruth nodded once. "Then we understand each other?" The hearing was set. The 10 days passed in a specific kind of tension that Evelyn had not experienced before. Not the anxious waiting of someone passive, but the taut readiness of someone who has done what can be done and is now holding the line. She went about the work of the ranch. She made bread on Tuesdays and Fridays. She helped Silas with a second section of fence that he'd decided needed attention. She did not let herself think too far ahead. 2 days before the hearing, a letter arrived for her from Thomas. It was shorter than his first letter. 4 lines. He said he was sending the documents she'd asked for under separate cover. He said he was sorry. He did not expand on the sorry or explain it further, which told her he'd run out of ways to justify it and had landed, finally, in the bare fact of it. The documents arrived the following day. Originals, not copies, which surprised her. 3 letters between himself and Albright, 1 receipt for the passage fee, 1 note in Albright's handwriting confirming the terms of Thomas's debt absorption. She sat at the kitchen table and read them, and then she looked at Grant, who was across the table from her. "He sent the originals," she said. "I see that." "He didn't have to." "No," Grant said. "He didn't." She thought about Thomas. She thought about him sitting in Philadelphia with these letters in his possession, knowing what they documented, choosing to send them instead of burning them. It wasn't redemption. It didn't come close to erasing anything, but it was the one choice, the one actual choice, that had cost him something. The protection of his own position, the ability to deny later that he'd known. He'd sent the originals. She tucked the documents in with the others and didn't say anything else about it that night. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the sky a hard winter blue with no clouds and no mercy. Grant drove. Silas insisted on coming, which no one argued with, and he sat in the back of the wagon in his good coat with his hat pulled straight and his jaw set with a particular dignity that made him look younger than he had in months. The courthouse room was already crowded when they arrived. That surprised Evelyn. She had expected a procedural hearing, a small and formal thing, clerks and paperwork, and the careful language of legal process. What she found was most of Ash Hollow. Word had moved through the town with the efficiency that only small towns achieve, and people had come to see what happened when a forged debt notice met a woman who wasn't going to pay it. She walked in with Grant at her left and Silas at her right, and Ruth Caswell, who had arrived before them and was standing near the front with her wooden box under her arm, gave Evelyn a single nod that meant she was ready. Warren Albright was there. She had expected that too. He was standing near the window with Aldous Webb beside him, a thin man with a briefcase who had the permanently worried expression of someone whose job was managing other people's mistakes. Warren looked at Evelyn when she came in, and she watched him run the calculation, the quick reading of the room, the assessment of what had assembled against him. She looked back at him with a steadiness she had been practicing, not for this moment specifically, but through every morning of the past several weeks when she'd built fires in the cold dark and reminded herself what she was made of. Harlan Briggs called the hearing to order. County Clerk Foster, a compact man with rimless spectacles, sat at the desk that served as the bench. He had the documents. He had Ruth Caswell's testimony, submitted in advance. He had Evelyn's formal contest of the debt, laying out the grounds. What he had not anticipated, and what Evelyn watched land visibly on his face, was Thomas Hart's originals. Grant put them on the desk. Foster looked at them. He read the note in Albright's handwriting. He read the receipt. He looked at Albright across the room. Webb stepped forward immediately. He was good at his job in the way that people are good at jobs that require no conscience. Fluid, quick, certain. "These documents are of unknown provenance," he said. "They cannot be authenticated in this setting. The debt notice was filed in proper form with the county clerk's office, and the signature on the debt notice," Briggs said, from where he was standing, "is Aldous Webb's." A stillness in the room. Foster looked at Webb. "Is that accurate?" Webb's fluidity did not entirely abandon him, but something in it shifted. "I filed the document on behalf of my client. The question," Foster said, with the precision of a man who has been waiting for 2 years to ask it, "is whether the underlying debt is real." He held up Thomas Hart's letters. "Because I am looking at correspondence that suggests it is not." What happened over the next hour was not clean or dramatic in the way that things are clean and dramatic in stories. It was procedural and at moments tedious, with Webb making arguments and Briggs responding and Foster writing things down and asking questions in the careful language of a man building a record. Ruth Caswell read from 3 of her husband's letters in a flat, precise voice that left no room for interpretation. Foster entered Thomas Hart's documents into the record over Webb's objection, citing the authentication provided by the original postmarks and the corroborating correspondence. Warren Albright said nothing. He stood by the window the entire time and said nothing, which Evelyn thought was its own kind of testimony. At the end of the hour, Foster looked at his notes, and then at the room, and said that the debt notice filed against one Evelyn Hart was suspended pending a full review, that the documentation and evidence raised substantial questions about its legitimacy, and that he was forwarding the matter, including the question of the forged filing, to the circuit judge's docket in the spring. He said it in the language of procedure, but what it meant, in the language of the room, was clear enough. The crowd understood it. She could feel the understanding move through the people around her. The small adjustments of posture and expression that meant they were revising their picture of the situation, revising their picture of her. Webb gathered his briefcase and moved toward the door without making eye contact with anyone. Warren Albright followed him. At the door, he stopped. He did not look at Evelyn. He looked at a point somewhere near her left shoulder, which was the closest he was willing to come to looking at her directly. "This isn't over," he said. It was exactly what a man says when it is in fact largely over, and he knows it. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'll be ready." He left. Silas made the sound beside her. Not quite a laugh, something shorter than that, and Ruth Caswell closed her wooden box with a precise click, and Grant put his hand briefly on Evelyn's shoulder, just for a second, and then took it away. She felt the weight of it even after it was gone. Outside, the winter sun was doing its best with the cold air, and Ash Hollow's main street looked exactly as it always did. The same mud, the same buildings, the same empty flower boxes on the general store window. But people were coming out of the courthouse behind her, and the looks they gave her were different than the looks that had followed her off the stagecoach in October. Not all of them warm, not all of them friendly, but different in a way that mattered. She stood on the step of the courthouse with the cold air on her face and let herself breathe for a moment. Just a moment. There was still the circuit judge in the spring, still Thomas and the long, complicated question of what remained between them, still Warren Albright, who was not, whatever he'd said, simply going to accept the outcome of an afternoon. But today was today. Today the record existed. Today the lies had a shape in public documents, and the truth had one too, sitting in the same file, and no one in Ash Hollow was going to forget what they'd seen in that room. Grant came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood there in the cold the way he stood through most things, present, unhurried, not requiring anything from the moment. "Thank you," she said. "You did that," he said. "We did that." He was quiet for a second, then, "Yeah," he said. "We did." They walked back to the wagon, the three of them, through the cold, bright morning, and went home. The ride home from town was quiet in the way that follows something large, not uncomfortable. The three of them had moved past the kind of silence that needs filling. Silas sat in the back of the wagon with his coat buttoned to the collar and his hat pulled against the wind, and he looked at the hills the way a man looks at something he's glad to still be seeing. Grant drove with his usual economy of movement, the reins loose in his hands, the horses finding the road without much guidance. Evelyn sat beside him and watched the land open up as they moved north out of town, the low hills flattening into the wide, pale grass of the valley, the creek catching the winter light in short silver flashes through the bare cottonwoods. She felt, more than anything, tired. The specific exhaustion that comes after sustained tension, not the tiredness of work, which was a physical thing she'd gotten used to, but the tiredness of having held yourself at a certain pitch for weeks and then being allowed finally to come down from it. Her shoulders ached. She hadn't noticed until now. "Albright will contest the circuit judge's review," she said, not to anyone in particular. "He'll get Webb to file something." "Probably," Grant said. "It won't change the outcome. Foster's record is clear." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm just saying it out loud." "I know that too," he said. Silas from the back said, "A man like Albright contests things until it costs him more to contest than to let go. You've already made it cost him something today. By spring, it'll cost him more." He paused. "Let the judge do his work. You've done yours." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead with the equanimity of a man who had lived long enough to know that most things resolve in their time, slowly and imperfectly, and that this is not the same as them not resolving. "When did you get wise?" she said. His mouth moved, the crooked, brief thing that was the Mercer version of a smile. "I was always wise," he said. "I was just too far inside my own head to use it." She faced forward again. The ranch appeared in the distance, the barn roof first, then the house, the way it always appeared coming up the Hollow Creek Road, incrementally, as if offering itself piece by piece rather than all at once. She had stopped thinking of it as a stranger's place sometime in November. She wasn't entirely sure when. The circuit judge's letter arrived in February. It came with the first genuinely warm day of the year, the kind of day that isn't really warm but feels like an extraordinary gift after months of real cold. 50 degrees and clear, with the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the mud beginning its annual return to the roads. Grant brought the letter from town along with a bag of cornmeal and a new axe handle and a letter from Thomas that Evelyn set aside to read later. She read the judge's letter first. The debt notice against Evelyn Hart had been found to lack legitimate basis. The filing was declared invalid and expunged from the county record. Furthermore, based on the documentation submitted at the preliminary hearing, the court was referring the matter of the fraudulent filing to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review of potential charges against the parties responsible. Aldous Webb's name was in the letter. Warren Albright's was not, but the reference to parties responsible for the arrangement underlying the filing was precise enough that everyone who needed to understand it would. She folded the letter. She sat with it for a moment in the kitchen, the warm February light coming through the window, the dogs asleep in a pile by the back door. Then she opened Thomas's letter. He had written 4 pages this time. More than she'd expected, less than she needed, which was probably accurate to who Thomas was and who he was going to remain. He told her that he had been contacted by the prosecutor's office. His name had appeared in the submitted correspondence, which he'd known it would when he sent the originals, and she understood now that he had known that and sent them anyway. He said he had agreed to cooperate fully, that his attorney had advised him this was the appropriate course, that he was, here he used the word remorseful, which was a more formal word than sorry, and she wasn't sure if that meant he felt it more deeply or just had better legal counsel now. He said one other thing. At the end of the 4th page, in the cramped forward-leaning handwriting she'd known all her life, he wrote, "I think about what Father would have said about what I did. I think about it more than I expected to. I don't have a way to make that right with you, but I wanted you to know I think about it." She read that part twice. Then she put the letter down and looked out the window at the yard, where Silas was doing something near the garden fence. She'd told him about the seed tin in December, shown him the packets, and he had taken to checking on the garden site with a regularity that had nothing practical about it and everything human. She thought about forgiveness. She thought about it the way you think about a complicated piece of machinery. Not sentimental about it, not pretending it's simple, just trying to understand how it actually works. Thomas had done something that could not be undone. He had known that and sent the originals anyway, which was one real choice in a string of bad ones. It didn't make the bad ones disappear. It didn't make her trust him. It didn't mean they would go back to whatever they'd been before, which hadn't been much anyway. But she thought, a man who thinks about what your dead father would say about his choices is not entirely lost. He might be salvageable. Not today, and not without a long time and a lot of demonstrated evidence. But possibly. She wrote back. She kept it short. She told him the judge's ruling, which he would learn through his attorney soon enough, but which she wanted him to hear from her. She told him that she received what he'd said about their father. She told him that she was staying in Nebraska, that she had work here, that she was well. She did not say come and visit. She did not close the door either. She sealed the envelope and put it with the outgoing mail and went to help Silas with the garden fence, because the ground was soft enough now to work, and the seed packets weren't going to wait forever. Spring came the way it always does on the frontier, chapon. Not gradually, not kindly, but in fits and reversals. A warm week followed by a late freeze, mud and then ice and then mud again, and the grass coming back in its own time without asking anyone's permission. The cattle that had made it through the winter were thin and needed watching. Grant was on the range most days from first light, and Evelyn noticed that he was moving differently than he had in October. Harder, faster, with more at stake. The particular urgency of a rancher in spring when everything that died over winter becomes visible and everything that survived needs tending simultaneously. She started the garden in March. Silas helped. That was the thing she hadn't entirely anticipated. She'd expected to work it alone, had been prepared to, but Silas was there the first morning she went out with the spade, already in his work coat, already assessing the beds with the eye of someone who had watched this ground for 30 years. "The tomatoes go on the east side," he said. "Margaret always said the east side got the right morning light." "I read that on the packet," Evelyn said. He nodded. "She wrote it down the first year. After that, she just knew." They worked the beds for 3 hours that first morning, breaking up the soil that had compacted over years of neglect, finding the old bed boundaries under the weeds, resetting the stakes that had fallen. It was hard work, and Silas tired more quickly than she did, but he didn't stop, and she didn't suggest he rest because she understood that some things matter more than physical ease. By noon, they had 3 beds turned and ready. Silas sat on the overturned bucket he'd brought out for the purpose and looked at the garden, and then at the house, and then at nothing in particular. Evelyn sat on the ground beside him because she didn't mind the mud, and there was nowhere else to sit. "She'd have had opinions about how you've done this kitchen," Silas said. "Good or bad opinions, Silas?" He considered. "Both, probably." She had opinions about most things. Said a kitchen was a woman's argument for how the world ought to be ordered. He looked at the turned beds. This, though, this she would have liked. He was quiet for a moment. "I should have done this years ago. Let it go to seed the way I let everything go." "You weren't ready," Evelyn said. "That's a generous interpretation." "Maybe, but it's true." He looked at her sideways. "You know what I think about you, Evelyn Hart? I have some idea. I think you came here with nothing, and you've given this place more than it had any right to expect from you." He said it the way he said most things that mattered, directly, without embellishment, looking at the garden rather than at her. "I think my son knows that. I think he's been trying to figure out what to do about it for about 4 months. She didn't say anything. She looked at the turned earth. "I'm not interfering," Silas said. "I'm just telling you what I observe. A man who keeps finding reasons to be in the same room as a person he supposedly just employs is a man working up to something." He stood up from the bucket with the careful effort that cold mornings required. "That's all." He took the bucket and went inside. She sat in the garden for a while longer, looking at the beds, thinking about seeds and what they required. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the right conditions in the right sequence, and patience, and someone willing to keep showing up. The thing with Grant happened the way things happen when 2 people have been circling something for long enough that the circling itself becomes unsustainable. It was an evening in late April, the kind of evening where the air finally smelled like something other than cold, where the light lasted long enough after supper to feel like a gift. She had been in the garden after the dishes were done, doing the small particular work of early planting, the beans going in first, the cabbage starch she'd been nursing on the windowsill for 3 weeks, the time that she was fairly sure had seeded itself from some root that had survived the neglect. Silas had gone to bed early. The dogs were somewhere in the yard. Grant came out of the barn and saw her in the garden, and instead of going inside, walked over and leaned on the fence the way he sometimes did when he was thinking about something and needed a place to put his hands. She kept working. He watched. After a while, he said, "The beans are going in late." "Briggs said first week of May," she said. "I'm early, not late." "Briggs doesn't farm. Neither do you." "I know when beans go in." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at the garden with the expression she'd come to know, the one that meant he was talking about one thing and thinking about another. The evening light was doing something to the angles of his face that she noticed without meaning to. "What's on your mind, Grant?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He pushed his hat back. She recognized the gesture. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a while," he said. "I keep waiting for the right time, which is something I know better than to do because the right time usually doesn't exist, and you just end up having wasted time waiting for it." "That's accurate," she said. "I'm not good at this," he said. Not apologetically, just as information. "I know." He looked at her. "I don't want you to leave." She held very still. "Not?" He stopped, started again, because Grant Mercer, when he was being honest, was also Grant Mercer at his most imprecise, and she found that she valued the imprecision because it was real. Not because of the ranch, or the cooking, or... He made a short, frustrated gesture. "The ranch is better because you're here. My father is better. I'm..." Another pause. I'm better, that's what I'm trying to say. And I know that's not the same as saying what I actually mean, but I'm working up to it. She put down the small trowel she'd been holding. She stood up. She came to the fence, on her side of it, and looked at him on his side of it. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in October with 72 cents and a broken engagement, and the particular kind of numbness that comes from having been treated as though your life belonged to someone else. She thought about what it had cost her to trust the first things she'd trusted here. The warmth of the kitchen, the weight of the seed packets, the sound of Silas talking about his wife at the dinner table. What it had cost her to let herself stop surviving and start living here, even provisionally, even without certainty. Nothing was certain. That was the thing she had learned, the thing that the whole of the last 7 months had demonstrated with precision. Warren Albright had been certain. She had planned a certain life, and it had come apart in the mud of a frontier street. Certainty was not on offer. What was on offer was this man who was bad at saying what he meant and kept trying anyway. This ranch that smelled like bread twice a week. This garden with its seed packets and its dead woman's handwriting and its slow, insistent returning to life. Then say what you actually mean, she said. He looked at her across the fence. The evening light, the smell of turned earth, the dogs coming around the corner of the barn and sprawling in the yard. None of it was elegant. It was just real, and that was better. I want you to stay, he said, not the way it started. I want you to stay because this is yours too if you want it. The ranch, the garden, He stopped. Me, if you want it. She was quiet for a moment. She was not going to perform uncertainty she didn't feel. She had done enough performing in her life, had been managed and arranged and moved around by people who decided her life for her, and she was not going to do the thing where you make a person wait for an answer you already have because you think it makes you look less eager. She was done with all of that. I want it, she said. He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, and it told her exactly how much he'd been carrying the question. She opened the garden gate and came through it. He met her on the other side, and she looked at his face in the last of the April light, and it was the same face she'd been reading for months, the same guarded, tired, honest face, except that right now the guard was down completely, and what was underneath it was simple and clear and entirely his. He kissed her once, briefly, and then they stood in the yard in the early dark with the dogs milling around their feet and the horses making their evening sounds in the barn and the house behind them with its lit window and Silas, probably, sitting in the kitchen with his coffee and the photograph of Margaret propped against the sugar bowl. I should finish the beans, she said. The beans can wait until morning, he said. She thought about arguing on principle. She decided against it. They went inside. The circuit judge formalized the ruling in May, exactly as Foster had predicted. The fraudulent filing charges moved forward against Aldous Webb, who negotiated a settlement that involved him leaving the territory and not returning, which was the pragmatic outcome that small frontier jurisdictions often arrived at when pursuing things further would cost more than it resolved. Warren Albright's name appeared in the formal record as an associated party to the arrangement. His father-in-law, Harold Whitmore, read that record, and the conversation that followed between Whitmore and Albright was, according to Mrs. Pooley, who had it from 3 separate sources, prolonged and not pleasant. Eleanor Albright came to the ranch once, in June. Evelyn had not expected that. She came alone without announcement on a Tuesday afternoon when the beans were up and the tomatoes were doing something promising. Evelyn was in the garden. She heard the horse and looked up and saw Eleanor dismounting at the fence with the self-possessed manner that had not changed since October. The manner of a woman who had grown up being introduced to rooms and had learned to walk into all of them without hesitation. She looked at the garden. She looked at Evelyn. I didn't know, Eleanor said, about Philadelphia, about what Warren arranged with your brother. She said it without preamble, without apology in the soft, decorative sense, but with the directness of someone delivering information they believe the other person deserves. I found out when my father did. I wanted you to know that. Evelyn stood up and brushed the earth from her hands. She looked at Eleanor Whitmore Albright, who had married a man she apparently hadn't fully known, which was its own kind of loss. I believe you, Evelyn said. For what it's worth. Eleanor nodded. Something moved briefly across her composed face. I heard about the garden, she said, which seemed like a change of subject, but probably wasn't. Margaret Mercer's garden. It's coming back, Evelyn said. Good. She gathered her reins. She paused. My grandmother said that a garden is the most honest thing a person can make. You can't lie to a garden. It either grows or it doesn't. She rode away. Evelyn watched her go and then turned back to the tomatoes, and that was that. She did not tell Grant about the visit until that evening at dinner, and she told it simply, without commentary. Silas listened and then nodded as if something had been confirmed for him. Grant listened and looked at his plate for a moment and then said, "She's not a bad person." "No," Evelyn said. "She's not." "Just married one," Silas said. Nobody argued with that. The engagement, if you could call it that, it was more a conversation than an event, more a decision already made than a proposal in any formal sense, happened in July. Grant had been talking for weeks about the winter preparations, about the need for more cattle before the fall, about whether the North Pasture could sustain another herd, and in the middle of this conversation one morning over coffee, he said, without transition, "We should get married before the hard freeze." Evelyn looked at him. "That's the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I'm a practical person," he said. "You said that to me in October, first conversation we had." "It's still true." She looked at her coffee. She looked at him. "Is this because of the winter preparations? Are you marrying me for logistical reasons?" "I'm marrying you," he said, with the deliberate patience of a man choosing his words, "because I can't imagine this ranch without you in it, and I've stopped trying to imagine it because it makes everything look worse." He set his cup down. "The winter preparations are also a factor. I'm not going to lie about that." She laughed. A real one, the full kind. He watched it happen with the expression he got sometimes when she did something that caught him off guard in a good way, slightly startled, deeply pleased, trying not to show either too obviously. "Yes," she said. "Yes to which part?" "Yes to all of it," she said. "Yes to you. The logistical concerns can come along for free." They were married in September at the ranch with Mrs. Pooley and Ruth Caswell and Harlan Briggs and a small gathering of people who had watched the story of Evelyn Hart move through Ash Hollow from October to October and had revised their understanding of it along the way. It was not an elaborate wedding. The garden provided what the garden had to offer in September, so the last of the tomatoes, the beans finished, the calendula still going strong in orange and yellow, because Margaret had written on the packet that they were good for the bees, and she had not been wrong. Silas walked Evelyn in because she had no one else, and because he wanted to, and because when she'd told him that he'd looked at the window for a moment and then said, "It would be my honor," in a voice that meant exactly that. Afterward, when the guests had gone and Silas had gone to bed and the ranch was quiet, Evelyn stood in the garden in the September dark and looked at what had grown. The tomatoes from Ohio, the scarlet runners climbing their stakes, the thyme that had seeded itself back from whatever root had survived the neglect, the calendula still burning orange in the darkness. She thought about Margaret, who had planted all of this and written it down and marked the most important packet simply for next year. She thought about what it meant to pass something forward without knowing who would receive it. She thought, "I am someone's for next year. I am what the ranch was waiting for through all those years of grieving and silence and frozen rooms. And I didn't know it when I arrived, and I wasn't looking for it, and it found me in the dirt of a frontier street on the worst day of my life." There is a kind of life that doesn't get handed to you. You don't stumble into it by being in the right place or knowing the right people, or being fortunate in the way that fortune usually means. It comes from something harder and less elegant, from being left somewhere that feels like the end of things and deciding that it isn't, from getting up in the cold dark and making the fire because that's what the morning requires, from trusting slowly and carefully the things that prove themselves worth trusting, from refusing, even when every reasonable argument supports it, to become small. Evelyn Hart had arrived in Ash Hollow with 72 cents and the stairs of a town burning into her back. She had been managed and arranged and shipped across the country by men who looked at her life and saw a problem they could solve to their own benefit. She had stood in the mud in October with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. And she had rebuilt a house, not the physical structure. The beams and boards were Grant's and Margaret's and Silas's, older than her arrival. But the house in the sense that matters, the warmth in it, the table that people came back to, the bread that rose twice a week, the garden that remembered what it was for, The old man who had come back from wherever grief had taken him to sit in his kitchen and tell stories about his wife. The frontier remembers everything, and it had remembered the scandal of her arrival for exactly as long as scandals hold up against the weight of ordinary evidence. What Red Lantern Ranch remembered was longer and more durable. The winter she arrived, what she cooked from nearly nothing, the fence she helped rebuild, the seed tin she found on the top shelf, the hearing she walked into with her back straight, the garden that came back to life in the spring. The woman who had been nobody's wanted was nobody's charity case. She had earned this ground the way you earn anything worth having, by showing up when it was hard and staying when it was harder, and refusing, at every turn, the story that other people wanted to tell about her. She was not finished. There would be lean years and difficult winters, and things that went wrong in ways that no amount of preparation could prevent. Thomas was still Thomas, and the distance between them was still what it was, and the world was still the world. She was not under any illusions about the smoothness of what came next. But she was here. Her name was on the deed now. Grant had insisted, quietly and entirely without drama, and she had let him without false modesty, because she had earned it. Her seeds were in the ground. Her bread rose in this kitchen. Her hands had built this back from grief, and her stubbornness had cleared her name in a public record, and her presence had brought a man who'd gone silent back to something like himself. Inside the house, Grant was still at the kitchen table. She could see him through the window, the lamp burning, the notebook open. He would be writing in it the way he did sometimes in the evenings, not the ranch records, which he kept in a separate ledger, but the other notebook, the private one she had never looked at and never would unless he offered it. Silas was upstairs, asleep, with Margaret's photograph on the nightstand where he'd moved it after Evelyn told him that she'd found it in the chest. Bess the dog was somewhere nearby, probably right at the garden fence, because Bess treated Evelyn's presence in the garden as a personal responsibility. She stood a little longer in the September dark, in the smell of the turned earth and the last of the season's growth, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not happiness as a performance, not satisfaction as a conclusion, but something real and earned and hers. The specific, complicated, imperfect piece of a person who has found, through no easy road, a place where their name is safe. Then she went inside because the morning would come early and the fire wouldn't build itself.